Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Vincent Colapietro, who's emeritus research professor at Penn State University. Vincent's most recent book is published in Spanish under the title Action, Sociability, and Drama. And it's a portrait of the human animal, that's his subtitle. His prior books testify to his considerable expertise in pragmatism and specifically in Charles Sanders Peirce. But he has broad interests, including a strong interest in education. He's done keynotes at the INPE conference before, for example, and we're delighted to have him here tonight. So Vincent, can I hand over to you?
Yes, you can. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the opportunity. So the full title of my talk is Acknowledgement, Affirmation, and Evasion. And as much as anything, I suppose I am concerned with evasion, the ways in which we evade topics, acknowledging difficulties, challenges, crises. Part of that comes from my interest in Cavell, and part of it from my interest in psychoanalysis. Okay, so my aim is to seize this occasion as an opportunity to reflect with you on the task of acknowledgement, and the emphasis has to fall on task. Part of my inspiration is a remark made by Wittgenstein in Uncertainty, that remark being, knowledge is in the end based upon acknowledgement. And so however formalizable and exact and precise knowledge might be, at base, at root, it's based upon something much less precise, diffuse, and formalizable. So I say. A much larger part of my inspiration is Stanley Cavell's creative appropriation of this Wittgensteinian insight. Though his appropriation of the theme of acknowledgement is to be found throughout his writings, arguably the locus classicus of Cavell's deployment is in the claim of reason. The focus here, in my paper following Cavell, is not on episodic acknowledgement, as important as situated performatives are. All I mean by that is that I see Paul on the street and I wave. There's a gesture of acknowledgement, and that would be an episode. And I am not here to slight that, but it's not the focus of my concern. The two are distinct, the episodic and the task, the episode and the task. They are distinct, but they are not separable. So the focus here is not on the episodic acknowledgement, it is rather on an open-ended process, and I would argue a self-imposed task. It's actually much more difficult than we appreciate to acknowledge the singularity, the presence, the complexity of the other, and therefore we have to make a point of doing so. Now, why is this? Okay. This task is intimately connected to the problematic of skepticism, at least as that problematic is reimagined by Cavell. The problem of other minds in the abstract general manner in which it's addressed by philosophers is one thing. That of your mind, the problem of your mind, in its irreducible otherness from my mind, to the point where on occasion we are hardly intelligible to one another, is quite another issue. And so the experience of utter bafflement and disconcerting perplexity are, I submit, not uncommon. How could this person possibly feel that way? How could that person possibly think that way? How could I, in the eyes of the other, possibly think that way or feel that way? Cavell was unwilling to separate the two problems, and he was unwilling to dissolve the problem of skepticism. Okay. I see you walk into a room and I acknowledge your arrival by a nod, by a wave, by a word. Nothing is more commonplace. But please note those occasions when I fail, or worse, refuse to acknowledge you. The deeper significance of episodic acknowledgement only begins to come into view when we consider failures and refusals to acknowledge others. Sometimes, when we simply do so in the most perfunctory manner, which in some sense amounts not to acknowledging the other. In contrast to episodic acknowledgement, there are those protracted processes, possibly coextensive with the entirety of one's life, in which one struggles to acknowledge the singularity and intelligibility of embodied, social, expressive others. Singularity and intelligibility can easily pull apart. Insofar as I deeply acknowledge your utter singularity, my familiar ways of understanding others become problematic. Insofar as I confidently comprehend your actions or utterances, the singularity of your presence tends to become rubbed smooth. What follows is little more than a crazy quilt of quotations, but they have been selected and arranged in such a way that my points of emphasis and perhaps even the direction of my thoughts can be discerned. If you do not press too hard for immediate intelligibility, if you grant me both your charitable attention and your fugitive, almost distracted playfulness, my meaning has a chance of coming into focus. So there are scenes of instruction, of course, and as teachers, thus, as learners and co-inquirers, it is helpful to imagine and reimagine scenes of instruction. So before a semester, before a class, it's not a bad thing to engage our pedagogical dramatic imagination. These scenes of instruction can range from the most formal to the least formal. They can range from the classroom to the pub or a ride in a taxi. Our relationship to the saka, to the material, the stuff we're trying to present, we're trying to get through. Our relationship to the material to be discussed or presented often eclipses our relationship to our audience. We as teachers are mediators. We come between. And there's two senses of coming between. There's a sense in which the curtain falls between me and you and cuts us off from one another. And there's the sense of coming between where my lenses come between my eyes and my field of vision such that it facilitates the connection rather than eliminates it. So attention to the material to be presented should be complemented by attention to our audience. Our role is, to repeat, one of mediation. And then I need not say this, what I just said before. Again, there are two senses of between, to cut off and to connect. Mediation may never be completely innocent, however. It is always potentially disastrous. The teacher who turns off a student forever to the subject that individual is endeavoring to make available to the student has tragically failed in his or her task. The teacher becomes too high a wall to climb. I am often inclined to respond to students who disclose they hate history by suggesting, perhaps you only hate your history teacher, but do you hate history itself? So I'm making several comments about what I call the pedagogical imagination, and I think this is true. I would like to hear from you. I think the pedagogical imagination is a genre or a form or a species of the dramatic imagination. I do think we're dramatic animals, and that deliberation is primarily a rehearsal in imagination of possibilities. What in this setting or that would facilitate instruction? I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves in anticipation of entering any scene of instruction. What would most likely frustrate or undermine instruction? Imagining scenes of instruction, then, is the work of dramatic imagination, and I take this to be a form of imagination integral to the pedagogical imagination. This work forces, or at least invites us to avoid a one-sided approach to responsibility. As important as the subject is, the subject matter, the material, the subjectivity of our students is no less important. What makes this delicate and difficult task all the more so is that it is so often an erotically charged and therapeutically entangled task. The presence of eros is, in my judgment, undeniable. It's shot through every human relationship and therefore pedagogical relationships. The need for an appropriate measure of restorative dialogue is in all likelihood ineliminable or ineradicable. The author Daphne Merkin once suggested that therapy is a corrective form of intimacy. Inspired by this, I am disposed to suggest that teaching often requires us to offer corrective forms of inquiry, interpretation, and critique. That's because all of us, to some extent, have incorporated within our habits of thinking, within our sensibility, flawed, perhaps deeply flawed, forms of inquiry, interpretation, and critique. What makes this difficult task all the more difficult is that corrective forms of heuristic engagement might require attention to corrective forms of human intimacy. The ways in which a person has been instructed by an authoritarian or an abusive parent screws up both things. It screws up both inquiry and it screws up intimacy, and therefore the two cannot be just torn apart. They're oftentimes entangled. So teaching, of course, can be very messy, and education can be an entanglement of tasks for which the teacher is not fully, if at all, authorized to undertake. And one can hear in the background the challenge: what right do you have to engage therapeutically with my child? Or in a different scenario, with me? Where is your license to practice therapy? And my suggestion is that properly understood and properly conducted, therapy is properly understood is integral to pedagogy. If Plato is right, if Augustine is right, or Freud, Jonathan Lear or Adam Phillips is right, then something has always already gone amiss, such that the need for offering corrective forms of inquiry attuned to the possibility of providing corrective forms of intimacy, something has always gone amiss, such that looking at both of these at the same time is an abiding task, abiding need. It is part of our inescapable pedagogical task. And I want to make a very quick historical note. Spinoza wrote a book entitled Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect. And it's not a very common English word, to be sure. And the word is often translated improvement, treatise on the improvement of the intellect. But as more than a few scholars have argued, the better translation is likely healing. Treatise on the healing of the intellect, with the implication there is something flawed or broken about our intellects. From the Platonic concern for therapy to present theorists, this is a manifest strand in education, manifest controversial and problematic strand in educational philosophy. Acknowledgement. To assist in creating a situation in which others can be relieved of the need to show off, be guarded, be ambitious or courteous in too conventional or formal a matter, is of course critical. To be held hostage by a preordained outcome tends to encourage manipulation rather than what Heidegger calls Gelassenheit, the allowing things and especially persons to be, allowing, it borders on a pun, allowing beings to be, allowing beings to be themselves and not what we want them to be, what we demand them to be, what we expect them to be, but to be. I didn't incorporate it in this in my slides, but as I was thinking over my talk, I was reminded of the line from T.S. Eliot, where Eliot writes in one of the four quartets, we had the experience, but missed the meaning. We had the experience, but missed the meaning. And I thought that in many ways, my talk is the reverse of that. Because I think that often we presume to have the meaning, and as a consequence of that presumption, we miss the experience. We miss the possibility for a disruptive or novel experience. I went the wrong way, sorry. There's a poet, contemporary poet, who has a poem to his mother. It's a very moving poem, actually. She's no longer with him, but the line that I most want to focus on is being or becoming alive to the play of life. Now, it may be the case that we're talking about something inanimate, and there's a sense in which a sufficiently attuned sensitivity and poetic sensibility can look at a configuration of rocks and see what Husserl calls the play of life. The play of life is not limited to animate beings. The play of the ways in which the colors in a painting, the masses and the configurations on a painting. Some paintings are alive. Other paintings are flat and dead. So being attuned to the play of life in whatever one encounters, and here he's praising his mother, and expressing a deep gratitude, saying, "Were it not for the way you taught me to look at the world, to see the life at play in everything, I would have to be lonely forever." And I suppose what Husserl's mother taught him, we aspire to teach our students, to see the life at play in everything. As I see it, the task of acknowledgement is linked to the art of attention, how to be attentive. Some days I think that's all I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to teach students to be deeply, quietly, fully, undistractedly attentive to the text, to the question of their fellow student, whatever. That art of attention is a variable, subtle, multi-level, and multifaceted capability. It ranges from an almost free-floating form of consciousness, sometimes seemingly indistinguishable from distraction or inattention. It ranges from that to sharply, intensely focused forms of concentration. A poet who wrote a very interesting book, prose, entitled The Art of Attention, in a very interesting series, says of poetry, what Revel says of poetry might with equal truth be said of pedagogy. Poetry is a form of attention, itself the consequence of attention. Benignly ignoring someone, however, can be, in some instances, the most apt form of pedagogical attention. As you know, as well as I do, if not better, we do not always have to react. Sometimes not reacting, sometimes being benignly inattentive, letting something go, might be the pedagogical gesture that's just needed in this situation. In experience, an essay to which from which Cavell has, an essay to which Cavell was drawn time and again, Emerson uses an arresting figure. I take this evanescence and lubricity of objects, and the word I want to focus on most of all here is lubricity, which is not a commonplace English word. I take this evanescence and lubricity of objects, which lets them slip through our fingers, pardon the typo, which lets them slip through our fingers, then when we clutch them hardest. I take this to be the most unhandsome part of our condition. So in addition to undisciplined attention, there is greedy or possessive attention, seemingly rapturous attention, but actually vacating preoccupation with telling others. So think here of a bead of mercury that you would press between your fingers. The harder you press, the more likely the thing is going to be impossible to hold. That would be an example of what Emerson means by lubricity. The object or the event, if you're really pressing too hard in a focal, almost violent way to ensure you possess it firmly, that is the precise thing that will guarantee it cannot be held in your fingers. And I told you it's a crazy quilt. There's a novelist and essayist, Walker Percy, who was actually a trained physician, and then he got tuberculosis. And while he was recuperating in the hospital, read a fair amount of Kierkegaard and Percy and a number of other people. And he abandoned the profession of medicine and became a writer, a novelist. His first novel was perhaps his most famous, The Moviegoer. And I take Percy to be an astute diagnostician of human distractedness, the ways in which, in various contexts, we distract ourselves and we're distracted from one another, and we distract others for that matter. There's an essay in a book which bears an interesting title and even more interesting subtitle, the book being The Message in the Bottle. In the subtitle, How Queer Man Is, How Queer Language Is, and What One Has to Do with the Other. Paul, would you tell me when I have like 10 or 15 minutes left, please? Yeah, thank you.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay. One way to read this essay, the essay being The Loss of the Creature, and I send a copy around, is as a reflection of how failures of acknowledgement occur. Such failures, in Percy's judgment, have disastrous, even tragic consequences. The title is indeed indicative of this possibility. We lose nothing less than the creature, the being we're trying to understand, we're trying to deal with. Somewhat paradoxically, the loss of the creature is linked by Percy to the loss of sovereignty. For the moment, let me focus on the author's phenomenological description of failed acknowledgement. Very often, this is rooted in an inability to be present in the present, an inability to be present in the present. an inability to inhabit an event without flying to a perspective other than that of a participant. And he takes this to be a fact that is connected to ironic distancing, a posture that might be the dominant posture of many contemporary minds, maybe especially American minds. So very early in the essay, it should be, a couple has taken themselves out of the experience. They come upon a tribal dance in the Southwest, and they're so excited about what they're witnessing that they can't wait to tell their anthropologist friend. They can't wait to tell any number of people. And as a consequence of their excitement, they're not in the event. They're already outside. And so Percy says the most extreme case of access by privilege is actually is conferred by disaster. He maybe pushes this too hard. I'm not sure. There's a way in which, when we're in disastrous situations, we begin to be attentive and deeper, fuller ways than when we're in our quotidian, everyday, routine manner of inhabiting the world. So what Percy goes on to say, if we look at the ways in which the student can recover the dogfish or the sonnet. So let me just back up. He says, if you encounter a sonnet in an English class, that's what you expect to encounter. And with that expectation, there's all kinds, it's a setup. You and I, as teacher and student, are being set up in ways that we know the meaning already, and therefore we might miss the experience of reading the sonnet. Or if you walk into a biology class and there on your lab table is a dogfish or some other specimen of animal, you know the routine and you know what you're supposed to do. Now, what Percy suggests is, what would happen if you walked into your English class and there was a specimen to dissect, or you walked into your biology class and there was a sonnet to read and ponder? He suggests you're more likely to encounter the sonnet in a deep, transformative way if you encounter in the biology class and if you encounter in the English class. And same thing for the fetal pig or whatever. So there's some kind of rupture of routine, be it a large or small, some kind of disaster that opens up possibilities for deeper encounters. We have to avoid the educators. I'm just floating this. I'm not necessarily advocating it. We have to avoid the educator's direct presentation of the object as a lesson to be learned. We've learned perhaps too well what it means to be presented with an object as a lesson to be learned. And what we learn is how to continue the routine ways in which learning unfolds. The only possibility, and this is Percy, of restoring access to the object is to encounter it as a being making claims of its own, apart from what the teacher has in mind. The shift of reality from a concrete thing to be encountered in experience, the shift from that to a specimen, a type, means nothing less than the loss of reality. What Alfred North Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. That would be taking something which was inherently abstract as though it were truly concrete. One example here that might help is that physics is oftentimes described as dealing with reality in its most concrete form, which is exactly the opposite. Physics deals with very high level abstractions, an object insofar as it is simply, say, mass in motion. And on the basis of that high level abstraction, it can make unbelievable predictions. But it's dealing with not concrete reality. It's dealing with concrete reality insofar as most of the sensuous and other qualities of the object have been abstracted. So what we're left with is, in fact, something, and it gives us tremendous power, but what we're left with is something, in fact, highly abstract. And to view it and to view it as concrete would be to commit what Whitehead calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So for Percy, there are two sorts of circumstances through which the thing may be restored to the person, and thereby the sovereignty of the creature might be reclaimed. And I'm not going to go into that right now, but I take Percy's point to be closely akin to, if not identical, with Cavell's. With Cavell's, when he writes in a phenomenal collection of essays, Philosophy the Day After Tomorrow, and here's Cavell: if I am to possess my own experience, notice, it might be that we're so governed by the presumption of meaning and the authorization of our own experience by authorities other than ourselves, we might be in that position such that we do not possess our own experience. If I am to possess my own experience, I cannot afford to cede my experience to my culture as that culture stands. I'm sorry for the omission. It really screws things up. I cannot afford to cede my experience to my culture as that culture stands. I must find ways to insist upon my experience. And if I find my ways unheard, or worse, unintelligible, I need to let the culture confront itself in me, driving me some distance to distraction. I would argue even worse, and I think Cavell would concede that readily. Again, a typo. We can so habitually cede our experience. We can so habitually cede our experience to our culture, not least of all to experts sanctioned by our culture, that we in effect virtually do not have the experience. It's one thing to have the experience but miss the meaning. It's another thing to presume the meaning and miss the experience. Insisting upon my experience, of course, carries risks of its own. If I am too dismissive of my culture in the terms it bequeaths to me to interpret my experience, I lose not only my culture, but also possibly my experience. Allow me to try to explain this if I can. The drive to comprehend can result in a process of effacement. And think here, you've encountered this kind of troubled student before, or this kind of very bright student before. So you know the routine, you know the type. Or I know the type. Do I? The unwillingness or inability to make whatever sense can be made out of objects or events, persons included. The unwillingness or inability to make whatever sense can be made out of objects, events, or persons is not just obscurantism. It is also the opposite of what it frequently pretends to be, an act of profound respect for the invincible mysterium of this thing in its singularity, in its aseity, its here-nowness. So while it can be obscurantism, it can be a profound respect. The thing is more than an X, defying any and all efforts to render it somewhat comprehensible. To begin, patiently yet imaginatively, to trace out patterns of connectedness, to allow the object itself to suggest certain angles of interpretation, is to honor its singularity without effacing its intelligibility. Might not this be the working definition of Cavellian acknowledgement? And I think we're at the end of what I wanted to say in terms of my prepared remarks. So the task of acknowledgement is an open-ended, delicate, difficult one, wherein we're living in, ideally, the creative tension between acknowledging the singularity of the being, but also committed to comprehending the being, the intelligibility of the being we encounter in our experience as fully and deeply as possible. If I encounter you as a singular, unintelligible being, that involves an effacement of its own. If I encounter you as an intelligible but not unique or singular being, that clearly entails an effacement of its own. So acknowledgement would seem to me to drive away from effacement. The failure to acknowledge results in the effacement. And I use that word advisedly, that expression advisedly, because we are, after all, not the only ones, but beings with faces, beings with bodies, beings who are essentially expressive. And we're always expressing more than we intend. And you are saying more than you mean. And you are certainly saying more than I comprehend. So in a Socratic fashion, my confession of ignorance, I do not know fully, finally enough, what the words emanating from this other mean. It seems to me the first step toward Cavellian acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent. And that was a very stimulating discussion. We usually adopt the practice of